Pie Problems Chapter 1. I remember the day was Friday, along in mid-August, about 8 in the evening. Ordinarily by that time there would be a pleasant breeze off the lake, but this night the air was hot and sultry as a strip dancer's face after the fifth encore. I'd started out for her apartment wearing a freshly laundered white linen suit, fresh blue shirt, white and blue striped tie to match, white socks with blue clocks and the blue scar of a stinking rifle bullet still visible across the corner of my jaw. "It ain't the heat, it's the humidity," the hack driver said, sighing. "You said Pearson near Michigan is the address, mister?" "That's what I said," I snapped and mopped some more perspiration off my face. The cabbie glanced swiftly up in his mirror, shrugged, clammed up and paid attention to his driving. He was thinking this guy is one of them surly ones, and I didn't blame him. I was feeling nasty and I was showing it. And the old scar which extended almost to the corner of the mouth wasn't helping things any. "Okay, chump, so she waggles her little finger and right away you go racing off to see her," I told myself. Assorted years ago I'd sworn it was the last time I'd ever see Taylor Townley. She was tawny blonde and she was elegant. And full of ambition. She wasn't the babe for me, Danny Gumbo, who took things as they came, not caring a hell of a lot if he made a mint of money or not, and having a little fun all along the way. Taylor the small-town girl who made good in raucous, noisy, burly Chicago. And along the way she picked up guys and used them and dropped them like trash littering the wayside. But not this guy, Angel Lamb. Gumbo got himself out before it was too late. Stevie took his 190 pounds of brawn and muscle and went off to the wars to become a hero. A nice big hero with a nice ugly scar across his face, and a deeper scar that didn't show because it was too deep down inside. Taylor got herself married to a sackful of money 2 weeks after you left, remember? Lovely Taylor. Sure. So now you're chasing right over there like a hungry dog going to rout up a remembered bone. I remembered her urgent words, less than an hour ago on the phone. "Can you come over?" It had been years, and her voice was still husky and low and capable of twisting your stomach into tight knots. The cab stopped on a nice quiet street on the near north side before a tall nicely kept apartment building with a doorman who held the door open for you and said in a nice polite voice, "Good evening, sir." Another polite, uniformed gentleman waited inside the small, correct lobby, a few feet away. "Whom do you wish to see, sir?" A quiet, impassive, unhurried man. I told him. "Are you expected?" "Yes, I'm expected," I said impatiently, and he walked unhurriedly to a house phone unit set in the wall within a little cubicle of the lobby. He spoke politely to someone for a moment, then nodded to me, turned and started through the lobby in his correct, unhurried manner. He stood aside at an elevator, waited until I got inside, then carefully closed the doors. We rode upstairs without having anything further to do with each other. The wide hallway was carpeted and quiet, and the door to Taylor's apartment was just across from the elevator. It opened as I stepped out. The maid standing there was young and had skin the color of pale smooth amber. She had big wide eyes, a cute mouth, and she would never be troubled too much with thinking. "Right this way, Mr. Gumbo," she said and led the way across the foyer into the living room. She wore a black dress and something that was supposed to be a little white apron but looked like a handkerchief. "Miss Taylor will be right out, Mr. Gumbo," the maid said. She took my Panama and indicated a chair. Then she went across the big room and disappeared someplace. It was a nice living room. Money had been spent on it. The rug went from wall to wall and cuddled your ankles like soft white snow. Everything else in the room was various shades of pale pink. The lamps were pink and chrome, and there were crystal knickknacks here and there. The drapes at the long casement windows were pink too and so long they covered several feet of rug. On the pale pink walls hung large photographs of beautiful women, the glamour girl kind found on magazine covers. They were smart, professional photographs that had been taken by someone who knew the business. They were Taylor's work, and she knew her business. Her studio worked with some of the biggest ad agencies in the loop. I sat back in a wide, deep chair and felt the quiet coolness of the expensive room touch me. The casement windows were tightly closed. Somewhere there came the soft hum of an air conditioning unit, gentle enough not to disturb one's thoughts. It was a good quiet room in which to think. But I didn't want to think. I got up and strode around the room and then sat down again. The 2 straight shots of scotch I'd quickly tossed off before coming here were now water over the dam. I needed a couple more. "Darling," she said in almost a whisper. In a way that made the little hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, like a cool wind over too warm skin. She stood there in the doorway across the room. She must have been there a full instant before she spoke, and there was a smile teasing her red curved lips but not yet in her cool, level gray eyes. She came smoothly across the deep carpet, both slim hands outstretched with the palms held downward, waiting for me to take them. "It's been so long," she watched me as she waited for a response. Lips outlined with a hint of makeup. A small rumble in the pit of my stomach, fueled by the memory of them. "I guess it has," I said inanely and held her cool smooth hands and felt the pain gnawing at my belly. Her eyes, wide and intelligent, went over me swiftly, then came back to my face. "Years?" I nodded. "Sit down," she said quickly. "Let me get you a drink." She turned, as though to call the maid, then moved toward a liquor cabinet. "Do you still like scotch?" "When I get it." "With soda." She turned, smiling. "You don't forget," I said. I watched her fix the drinks. She was tall and graceful and softly curved. Her tawny hair was burnt gold on top from summer sunlight. Her smooth features were tanned. She looked healthy and vital. She was wearing something that probably passed for a lounging robe and left nothing to the imagination about her beautiful shoulders and back. It was also cut low in front, and you didn't have to use your imagination there either. Taylor had a beautiful body. Her hair swept back from her high forehead, was tied some way at the back, then fell gently to her shoulders. Handing me one of the drinks, she sat on the long divan opposite me, curving a foot beneath her. Her deep eyes were bright. "Let me look at you," she said in that husky way. "It's so good to see you again, Gumbo." I let her look. I swallowed half the drink, hoping it would take the knots out of my insides. "Tell me all about you." I shrugged. "It isn't much." "Please do. You've never called me, you know." "I've been pretty busy." She let that pass. "Tell me about it." She settled down cozily in the deep cushions and the dress fell away from an outstretched leg. It was a nice leg, beautifully formed right up to the thigh, so why should she worry about showing it? It was something to show. I'd seen it before. It was still worth a look. So I looked. I gave her just a sketchy bit of it. I was lucky. I fingered the scar. One of them took me out of it a long time ago without mussing me up much. "It hardly shows," she said. "It wouldn't show at all if you didn't frown." I finished the drink and wished she'd get on with it. Maybe I didn't want to tell her that there wasn't much to smile about right now. The drink hadn't helped a bit. It was hell sitting there looking at her beautiful body and knowing she had married Alan Townley 2 weeks after I had gone off to be a hero. "Why did you call?" I said. She got up and took my glass and went over to the cabinet to refill it. With her back to me. "You never knew Alan, did you?" "No." When she came back across the room the half-smile had left her face. "You knew I married him?" I nodded. She handed me the glass and I watched her across the top of it as she sat down again. "I suppose that's why you never called?" I shrugged. "After all." I let it trail off. She said quickly. "I'll tell you why, Gumbo. You thought it wouldn't be proper to call a married woman, someone you had gone around with for over 2 years, and who still thought you were a pretty swell guy. A gal who remembered all the fun we had together." I grinned. "Well, would it?" A flush crept into her smooth cheeks. She said jumped to her feet and went to the liquor cabinet again. She jerked around and her gray eyes flashed. "I never knew you to rest on formalities." I finished the drink, staring at her over the rim of the glass. Anger made her eyes sparkle. She came back across the room, almost yanked the empty glass from my hand and returned to the cabinet. The drop of soda that she added to the 2 drinks didn't do any good at all. It was like sprinkling a lawn after a cloudburst. This time Taylor Townley sat down beside me and her left hand rested lightly on my knee. "You've changed," she said throatily. "Getting shot at does that to a man. Getting shot makes it a bit worse. You're hard and you're bitter. You were always a big rough guy. But never like this." She looked at me sideways. "Am I so different? Don't you care anymore?" She was close to me, her hand still on my knee, her lithe figure separated from me only by the thinness of the gown. I stood up, strode to the liquor cabinet and spiked the glass with straight scotch. I drank the stuff down, banged the heavy glass on the table and came back across the room. I was feeling the liquor and was wondering what hours her husband kept at the office. I was aware of Taylor Townley's eyes watching me curiously. Standing in front of her, I said harshly. "After all, you're married. Things are different, Damn it. Why didn't you leave me alone? Why bother calling me at the office? What do you think I am, anyway? I've got a heart and lungs and there's blood in me. I tick inside. I snapped my fingers before her curious, lovely face. I tell myself it was swell and terrific and all that, but now the lady's married and you forget her. She's private property. Go along and be a private detective, Gumbo, and forget all about Taylor. She's not for you, chum. Don't make your life miserable. Gumbo. She was also on her feet now. Very close to me. Hands pressed against my chest and the enticing fragrance of her all mixed up with the burn of the liquor in my guts. Gumbo, darling. I'm trying to tell you. Alan and I haven't lived together for a year. Furthermore, I stopped. I frowned down at her. She was tall, but I still had to look down into her upturned face. "I'm trying to tell you," she said. "It never worked out, Gumbo. We've been separated for a year. It's all over." Her hand slid down my chest and went beneath my arms. She held herself tight against me. "You haven't even kissed me," she said softly. I put my arms over hers. I tilted her head back and my fingers were lost in her tawny hair. Her warm lips came up and for a long moment there was only the delicate hum of the air conditioning unit. Finally she broke away and took a moment getting her breath. "That's better." I felt like I was rocking when I let go of her. Maybe I was. It was good scotch. "Now, we can talk sense," Taylor was saying. It took me a moment to gather that in. Along with it I detected a speculative sharpness rising in the back of her eyes. "I heard that you'd gone back to operating your own detective agency. That's why I called you." She wanted something. I should have known. "I called you because there's no one else I can turn to, darling. Have you got a cigarette?" I dug two out of the pack, lit both and passed her one. Unconsciously I had done it the way we used to do in the past when we were out driving. She smiled briefly, remembering, and letting me know that she remembered those nights along some deserted highway far up the North Shore. I still didn't say anything. "Alan has disappeared," she announced. She was sitting down again, but on the edge of the chair. There was tenseness in her. "You said you haven't seen him in a year." She shook her head. "I didn't say that. I said we hadn't lived together in a year. Naturally, I've seen him. I couldn't afford to let anyone know the way it was, especially business acquaintances. You know how it is when you're dealing with ad agency people. They're touchy as racehorses at the post. None of them guessed that Alan and I—" "He disappeared?" I said. She nodded. "A week ago. I've checked everywhere. There's no trace of him at all." I grinned a little. "Did he walk out on you, pet?" Abruptly she was on her feet again. She walked to a tier table and mashed out her cigarette. Her eyes had darkened. She snapped. "That's one of the things I want to know. If he's walking out, I'm not giving him the opportunity to divorce me. If divorce is what he wants, it's going to be the other way around. Nobody's making a fool out of me." I was intrigued. I've said Taylor Townley was ambitious and now I saw the angle. I told her, "I begin to see what you mean. You sue for the divorce and maybe you can collect a nice settlement. I understand the guy's worth a bucket full of dough. You did all right marrying him. You're a very smart girl, Taylor." Then I stood up and started across the room. "But all you need is a two-bit shyster lawyer who specializes in divorce stuff. Cut him in for a good slice and you won't have any trouble." My face was hot and the old scar seemed to be burning like a fiery iron across my jaw. "Now, if you'll just tell me where and how the maid put my hat." "There's something else," Taylor said. She said it in such a way that I paused, turning back to look at her. She hadn't moved away from the table, but stood there stiffly, eyes intent on my face, her voice almost a whisper as she spoke. "It's the real reason I called you," she continued. "Gumbo, you had a reputation once. You were supposed to be good. You did things in your own way and you didn't go around advertising it to others. I imagine it's still that way. You know your way around this town, and you can do this without anyone finding out, at least, yet." "Do what?" I said. "Find out if he's dead." "You mean?" "I think he is." I wondered where I had ever picked up the foolish idea I wanted to leave. Taylor needed someone. "Haven't seen him," she explained. "I haven't heard from him. He hasn't been at his office for a week, or up at the lake where the crowd is spending the summer." "Is that so terribly important? Maybe the guy had something to do." Slowly she shook her head. "Not Alan. When you're involved in as many deals as he is, you have to be on the job constantly. He never misses spending a part of each day watching the board at Simpkins Hart, a leading brokerage office on LaSalle Street. The market has been so erratic. And he always has a dozen things on the fire. You never know when someone is going to cut your throat. Shock widened her eyes the moment she said the last. She stared at me. I said, "Did he have any enemies?" "Naturally. Anyone who collects a fortune in a few years also collects some enemies along the way." Unconsciously her fingers caressed her soft throat. "Gumbo. You don't think?" I didn't say anything. "No, but you're thinking." "What else?" She was tense again. "What do you mean?" "Damn it, Taylor," I said impatiently, "get the rest of it off your chest and be done with it. Maybe the guy's dead. You don't love him, you practically said that. So there's something else. What?" My voice had the same effect as shaking her. "All right," she said. She gave me a contemplative stare. Apparently she was satisfied with what she found in my eyes, because she went on. "Suppose he's dead. Suppose I sit back and do nothing but just wait. A thing like underscore that could go on for months, years. I've got to know, Gumbo. Alan's insured for $1 million. I could use that money right now. I need it in the business. My God." I stood up again. I wanted to slap her across the face. "Wait," she pleaded quickly. "Please try to look at it my way, Gumbo. The uncertainty of the thing is driving me frantic. I can't go to the police. If nothing is wrong, everyone would laugh at me. And if he's alive, perhaps we'll learn what he's up to and I can act accordingly." Taylor was shrewd, an ambitious woman who didn't miss any bets. I asked, "What makes you think something might have happened to him?" Her gray eyes, intent, held on mine. "It was the weekend before last," she offered. "I was up at the lake. Alan dropped over to the cottage to see me early Saturday evening. A man came there asking to see him. I'd never seen the man before. Alan excused himself and the two of them went out on the porch and talked. There was an argument." "About what?" "It seemed to be about gambling. The man left. Alan left, too, shortly after. And I haven't seen him since." "You say you didn't know the guy?" She shook her head. "But I'd know him if I saw him again." She frowned in thought. "He was clean-shaven, but he had the kind of skin that always looks blue where the beard grows. He was thin and dark and he might have been Italian. He was the kind of person you might find around the racetrack. Not a tout, but a clever, quiet man who had money. There was a streak of gray right in the center of his thick dark hair." "You'd make a good private eye," I said. "I notice people." I smoked a cigarette and was silent for a while. Taylor was watching me. I knew a dozen reasons why I shouldn't touch this job with a 10-foot pole. If something did turn up, I was the guy who used to run around with Taylor. People would remember. I was going to be caught right in the middle if something had happened to Alan Townley. So I said, "When are you going up to the lake again?" "Gumbo," she practically purred as her face lit up. "Then you are going to look for him?" She knew damn well I was. She came over and flung her arms around me and held on to me a moment. Then she looked up and said excitedly, "I'm driving up tonight. It only takes a couple of hours. You can come along with me." "That would tear it," I said. I shook my head. "No, I'll drive up in the morning. I've still got the old truck. Give me the address and I'll see you up there." She went to a desk and wrote something down on a slip of paper. It was the name of a cottage at a spot up in the Chain o' Lakes region in Wisconsin. It wasn't far from town. I'd been there a few times in the past. This particular spot was patronized by the ad agency people, a clique of them had been going there for years. I'd known some of them. They'd remember me. I'd met most of them through Taylor. She had them call me in the time a millionaire client had been found floating around sunning himself in Lake Michigan. Very dead and bloated. He'd been a client of the advertising agency for which Taylor did the bulk of her work. Everyone had thought the guy had been murdered. But it was suicide. He'd been on a liquor for a week and one night jumped off the pier beyond the Edgewater Beach apartments. Few people had known he was a dipsomaniac. Taylor interrupted my jaunt into the past. "I've written the phone number down, too. I'll be there all weekend." You'd think she was starting on a trip to Bermuda. There was too much bright excitement in her eyes. "What time will I see you tomorrow?" "You might not see me at all." I shook my head, looking at her. "For a bright girl, you're sometimes dumb as hell. Naturally we can't be seen too much together up there. If something has happened to Alan, people are going to start raising their eyebrows." Taylor waved her hand lightly as though it were the least important thing in the world. "Don't be silly. You just dropped up there for the weekend, that's all. You were looking up old friends. I happen to be one of them. No one need know the real reason for your being there at all." "You're cute," I said. I looked around. The maid had never once appeared again after showing me in. "I'll get in touch with you." Seeing that I was ready to go, she nodded and called, "Wendy." The light-skinned colored girl appeared so quickly she must have been standing in the hallway taking everything in. And she had my Panama. Taking it from her, I said, "What big ears you have, Grandma." The maid gave me a curious look. I could tell she was trying to remember where she'd heard those words before. But her brain was too relaxed to be bothered. So she giggled and said, "Yeah, aren't you funny?" she said. I nodded. "I'm a riot." She didn't look like she agreed with my assessment, but she didn't disagree either. I decided to take it as a win in the joke column instead of calling it a draw. Taylor took my arm then and walked with me to the door. She expected to be kissed again. The maid was hovering around somewhere beyond the small foyer. I knew she'd remember just the kind of things you didn't want her to remember. I said, "Well, good night," and got out of there. On the way back downtown to my hotel room I picked up a pint of bourbon. A little later, sitting in my room, I cursed the heat and drank some of the stuff. I cursed Alan Townley for leaving his wife. If I had a wife like Taylor, I certainly wouldn't leave her. I cursed myself every time I thought how exciting it had been when I held her in my arms. I thought about the man with a gray streak running through his hair and who was more than likely a gambler. Taylor's description of him made it sound that way. I played around with an idea. With the sudden impulse to drive up to the lake that very night. Liquor gives you sudden impulses. I threw a few things in a bag, laid the police special and shoulder holster on top, looked around the room once, picked up my bag and left. It was pleasant driving, once I got away from the city and out along the open Skokie Highway. Chapter 2. It was a resort town. It did a nice summer business and a number of people stayed right there throughout the year. Most of them lived out of town at the various lakes scattered hither and yon, but there were a couple of the Greenwood looked as good as any. I found a parking garage nearby, left the car there and walked back down the main street. It wasn't too late, not much after 11. There were people on the streets and the movie house had not yet let out. The hotel was a big white frame building on the main thoroughfare. Rocking chairs lined the long veranda. There were green-painted metal fire escapes in front, above the porch. The lobby was big and cool. A small green neon sign above a doorway across the room read, "Log Cabin Taylor." I heard the tinkle of glasses and people talking. I went around some palm trees and put my bag down before the desk. "A single room," I told the clerk. He was a dainty little man with pale eyes and a carnation in his buttonhole. "You have a reservation, sir?" I shook my head. "I'm sorry, sir. We are filled up." I let him see the bill in my hand. His gaze fluttered to it, then back up again, and he looked like he just sucked on a lemon. He wanted to protest. "Good heavens, sir!" but decided not to. He shook his pretty head again. He repeated, "I'm sorry." I walked across the lobby and found the bell captain at his pulpit-like desk. I slid the 20 into his grip. "My name is Danny Gumbo. Would you mind seeing if I have a reservation? Single room." He took the money and said quickly, "Yes, sir." He was an alert young man with wise eyes. Gone only 3 or 4 minutes, he returned with a rectangular slip of paper in his hand. "Here you are, Mr. Gumbo. If you'll register, I'll have a boy take you up to your room." I went back to the desk, handed the dainty little clerk the slip and registered. With a slight smirk I stared at the fellow, but I could have saved the effort. His outward shell of impeccability couldn't have been dented with an axe. The room was good. It faced on the rear, had a large double bed that wouldn't cramp me, and there was a shower. The place was clean and cool. I watched the bellboy fuss around arranging shades, opening and closing bureau drawers as he stalled for his tip. I pulled a folded $5 bill from my pocket and tipped him. "I haven't been up here lately. How are the gambling spots?" Silently, he looked me over for a moment. He was no bigger than a jockey and looked like he knew his way around. "Valentine's Place is still operating out at the lake," he finally said. "That's just west of town. Only it's called the Oaks. They feature steaks and good dance music. Do you know anyone?" "Not anymore. I doubt if you get in the gambling part," he said. "You have to have a card." How do you get a card? He didn't say anything. I grinned. That puts us right back where we started from. I'm sorry, he said, and really meant it. If there's anything else. Not tonight, I told him. Apparently it was a wide open town. The people who came to this section had money to throw around. And where there's that kind of dough, you'll find sharp characters who know how to take care of it. After he left, I went down to the bar. The room was long, air-conditioned and fairly well-filled. Tables, chairs and bar were supposed to be of a rustic design, but they were veneered and polished so smoothly they would have served as mirrors. The light, peeking from old-fashioned lanterns, was intimate enough to make the lounge a popular gathering place. Most of the crowd was divided up in pairs, or foursomes. There were good-looking women wearing expensive jewelry. But there was no one I remembered. I sat there at the bar listening to the talk from a table directly behind me, four youngsters with too much money wondering what excitement they could find tonight. Abruptly I heard one of the lads give a soft whistle. "Say!" he exclaimed and sounded very pleased. One of the girls shushed him. "Quiet, you dope. That's Stevie Deering." "I don't know who she is," said the lad, "but she sure is a looker." "Now, listen," one of the girls started to complain. I turned slightly on the stoolie. The kids were looking toward the front of the room. I saw what they were looking at and I had to give the lad credit. Stevie was something to see. She was tall and rangy and silvery blonde. She wore a long blue gown and a short blue mink jacket. She probably looked better than she really was, for she knew how to use makeup. Just the same, she wasn't anything you leave out on the doorstep. Other patrons glanced at her as she stood there a moment glancing over the room. She seemed to be looking for someone. Then she started down along next to the bar. I turned back to my bourbon. The bartender had glanced her way, too. He was a short, solid, bald man. His eyes continued to follow the woman, then he was quickly wiping the bar alongside me. The bar didn't need wiping. "Evening, Miss Deering," he said, smiling. "Hi, Joe." The voice was soft, smooth. She had taken the stool beside me. She used a kind of perfume that I had never smelled before, and I liked what I smelled. It wasn't easy to forget. "Sherry, Miss Deering?" "I think so, Joe." A silvery, beaded small purse appeared beside my right arm on the bar. Casually I glanced up into the back bar mirror. Right then she was doing the same thing and our eyes met. She gave me a casual regard that said nothing. I went on about my drinking, beer, this time. She said to Joe, "Has Moose been in?" The bartender shook his head. "I haven't seen him all evening." I gave her a covert glance. She was frowning now. She would be a little older than she appeared, without makeup. 30, maybe. She'd been around long enough to know a lot of answers. "Aren't you working tonight at the Oaks?" She shook her head. I was interested now. The Oaks was the place the bellhop had mentioned. The place I might find the man Taylor had mentioned with the gray streak in his hair. "I was thinking of running out there," said Stevie Deering. "Moose said he'd be in town tonight. I haven't seen him anyplace." "Haven't you? Ain't he at the club?" "No." She finished the sherry and reached for her purse. Her arm touched mine. I glanced up and our eyes met again. They were quiet green eyes and she had probably used murine in them. The look still didn't tell me anything. Again she spoke to the barman. "Joe, would you mind calling me a cab?" "Sure thing." Putting down his towel he went to the end of the bar and picked up the phone off the handset sitting on the back bar. He came back shortly and told her. "They can't send a cab for about half an hour. They're busy." She frowned again. "Excuse me," I said. She turned her silvery blonde head. "I'm driving out to the Oaks," I said. "I'd be glad to give you a lift." Again she gave me that quiet regard. Beyond her the bartender was watching me. He shook his head imperceptibly in my direction but she didn't see it. "Well," she said as though thinking. "My car's in the garage just down the street." Then she decided. "Well, all right." I stood up. She started to open her purse. "I've got this," I said. So she started ahead of me down the room. As I handed the bartender his money, he said. "I wouldn't, Mac. That's Moose Valentine's woman." "Why not?" "I wouldn't, is all." I grinned at him. "The lady hasn't objected," I said briefly and followed her down the room. "Moose didn't call," she said as we drove westward out of town, along tree-shaded streets. The night was pleasantly cool now. The soft glow from the dashboard light softened the slightly sharp lines of her features. She sat there with her knees crossed and she had long, strong, good legs. I offered her a cigarette, struck a match and held it out cupped in my hand. Her hands touched mine as she steadied the light. She blew a lungful of smoke out slowly and looked across at me. "I don't recall ever seeing you at the Oaks," she said. "I've never been there." That's what I thought. Tea didn't seem to make any difference to her either way. "I take it you work out there?" I said. She nodded and explained. "Singer. Tonight's my night off." "Busman's holiday?" I smiled. "Or are you going to play a little roulette?" As she considered that, I said. "I haven't been up here in several years. I've sort of got out of touch. I thought I'd like to shoot some dice." "So that explains the offer of the ride," she said. "I don't know anybody out there. Maybe you could help me out." "Perhaps." I let it rest there for a while. The purr of the engine made a pleasant sound in the quiet night. Once I glanced at her face. Her lips were set too grimly for the kind of mouth she had. It could be a nice sultry mouth if she wanted it to be. This guy Moose must have stood her up tonight. Soon she pointed out a side road. "It's shorter that way." I followed the narrower road. Next we were skirting the lake. Here and there cottages showed through the trees. Light flickered across the water from some of them. Many of the houses had big boathouses, 2 or 3 car garages and at least dozen rooms. Nice little shacks in which to change to your bathing suit. A party was going full blast in a rambling white one that we were just passing. A gal was racing across the lawn with a drink in her hand and screaming like a hyena. A lubricated young buck on rubbery legs was chasing her. From inside the house music blared, a rock number that sounded more like thumps and noise from a distance than any sort of melody. Along with that, it sounded like 99 people were attempting to outshout each other all at once. "Nothing like a restful vacation in the country," I said. Stevie Deering's mouth twisted. "The stinking rich. Money buys anything you want up here." We passed a stretch of deep woods, then the sign appeared like a white ghost out of the night. The Oaks. It was long and rambling, the size of the ranch. There was a wide parking area in front, between the lake and the main building. Stevie said, "Drive around to the rear." I thought we might get something to eat, I suggested. I drove up from Chicago. "All right, but let's go around back anyway." There was a smaller, private parking space on the side of the building. We entered in a carpeted hallway that bisected the club. In the front part were the main dining room and apparently a dance floor, because you could hear the muffled beat of a band. A waiter came out of a doorway and started down the hall, a tray of dishes above his head. He paused, waiting until we passed, and his eyes seemed to raise a little as he saw Stevie. Then he frowned slightly. But she marched past him as though he were a hat-rack. We went through another door and were in a wide foyer now that led back from the main entrance. At the counter of the hat check room, a cigarette girl stood talking to the check girl. The scanty costume she wore revealed a cute figure, and a lot of it. She saw Stevie Deering, started to say brightly, "Honey, I thought tonight you were?" Then she looked at me and stopped. Her eyes became cautious. I was beginning to feel like a guy with a sign on his back that read, "Leave knives here." But what the hell? She didn't have to say yes. I began to develop a slow burn. Let somebody say something about us and they'd get their teeth knocked down their throat. I was all tightened up inside. Perhaps a fight would relieve the strain. We reached the dining room. It was big as a hotel layout, designed to cater to money. I saw champagne in silver ice buckets and waiters as numerous as customers. A head waiter holding menus the size of 3, posters appeared like magic. "A table for 2, Morris," said Stevie. But, the man started to shake his head. "One of those spares you always keep over there." She motioned ever so slightly with her beautiful head. I guess he'd been on the verge of telling us that everything was taken. But he bowed briefly and led the way through the room. My neck burned. Patrons were watching us across the room. You'd think I was escorting a duchess. Morris held a chair stiffly and properly, motioning to a waiter as he seated Stevie. He placed the menus before us. "What would you like to drink?" I asked. I didn't want to crowd this thing. The gambling rooms probably operated most of the night. Maybe I'd find out something if I waited. "Martinis would be good before the steaks," she suggested. "2 martinis, extra dry," I told the waiter. I saw Dapper Morris going across the room, but he wasn't moving toward the main entrance. He reached a doorway back near the bandstand and glanced back briefly. And he was looking at us. Then he disappeared. Stevie had not noticed. While we were sipping the drinks, the waiter walked over and said, "The steaks will take about 45 minutes. The band was playing some good numbers." "Dance?" She nodded. "All right." We ran the gauntlet of the room again. The dance floor was at the far end. Lights were dimmer down here and it was kind of private and cozy. A few couples were on the floor. She was a good dancer. Her movements were smooth and she was tall enough to fit into my arms nicely. We didn't talk much. You could tell she liked the music. She hummed the tune softly to herself. Our cheeks brushed lightly a couple of times. She bent her silvery head back a little and smiled up at me. "I like big men." Then, as though she had been giving it some thought, "You were kind of nice." I smiled back. "You're all right yourself, Duchess." Her fingers came up and gently touched the scar on my jaw. It was done the way a child innocently explores something. "The war?" "Uh-huh," I murmured. She moved her head, indicating the band. "Know that number they're playing?" "What is it?" "It's called Memories." Her voice was warm against my skin. I stared at a small space above her quiet eyes, dark green now in the soft light. Silently, she glanced up at me. Then she said, "I thought you weren't looking for." "I'm not married," I said. "That part of it is not important to me. There's another reason." She held my eyes calmly. "You're not a gambler. And you don't look like a guy who hangs around a lake with a fishing pole in his hand. You want something. What is it?" "I'm looking for somebody." She smiled a little. "A woman?" I shook my head. Stevie looked like the kind of girl who knew most of the answers. Perhaps she could help me. I also figured she was not one to shoot off her mouth. It was worth a try. "A man named David Townley," I said. "Know him?" "Oh, him." Her penciled eyebrows raised. "Reason why I want to know." "He comes here." "Alone?" "Not always." "Any women?" "Does he come with the same woman all the time?" She shook her head. "Different ones." "When was he here last?" She thought a second. "A week ago, maybe." I happened to glance toward the bandstand, then, and realized something was going on of which I hadn't been aware. Each musician, while still playing, was watching us as we moved across the floor. It should have been funny. A half-dozen pairs of eyes sliding left to right to left. Like a litter of puppies watching someone slowly wave a tempting bone back and forth in front of them. But it wasn't funny at all. Each man's eyes were concerned. The music stopped. We returned to the table and finished a second martini. I felt a glow again. A few more and I wouldn't give a damn about the way everyone in the place looked at us. Stiff, Dapper Morris slid up to the table and spoke to Stevie. "Moose wants to see you." Her face set in sudden sharp lines. "Moose is here?" I thought. Morris nodded and even the nod was stiff. "Upstairs in his office." Stevie's face lost a little color. I was mildly surprised. She didn't look like a girl who frightened easily. I looked up at the head waiter and felt the scar burning across my jaw. "So you pussyfooted right upstairs to tell him, huh? How would you like a punch in the mouth?" "I wouldn't start anything, friend," he said quietly. "No," Stevie pleaded, "don't do anything." Her eyes flashed like green crystal. "I'll see him." She stood up. "He can't push me around like this." Grinning now, I got up along with her. "Miss," I assured her, "no one's going to shove you around." She didn't want me to go, but I held her arm firmly and we passed through the doorway at the back of the long room. We climbed a flight of stairs. It was very quiet. The heavy carpeting muffled steps. They would muffle a shot, too, I thought, or a scream. The office was down at the rear of the hall. It was open a crack and I could hear voices talking quietly. Stevie marched down the hall with her shoulders held straight and her hands clenched. She was angry now. She hurried into the office and I was right behind her. I remember 2 or 3 men were sitting in the room, along with a man leaning back in a heavy swivel chair behind a wide, solid desk. "Now, listen, Moose," Stevie began and her voice was tight. "I looked all over for you. I waited." "Shut up," he snapped, not even glancing at her. Instead he looked at me. Moose Valentine was a clean-shaven, trim lad of about 40 with hot dark eyes and blue shadow around his jowls. There was an odd gray streak right through the middle of his thick dark hair. "Who's your boyfriend?" Moose Valentine demanded without taking his sharp eyes off my face. "I met him at the hotel," Stevie said. "When I couldn't find you, he gave me a ride out." "He?" I said, "Who is he?" "I don't know. But he was kind enough." "Get out," Valentine snapped. He repeated coldly. I said, "Shove off." Stevie's face was white and frightened again. All the anger that had been pent up in her seemed to wash away when she saw the cold fury in his eyes. She started toward the door, face frozen. I turned and said easily, "I'll be with you in a few minutes, Duchess." I watched her go out. Valentine must have got up then and come around the desk swiftly while my back was turned. His fist was moving through the air when I swung back to face him. It was too late to slide away from the blow. He caught me alongside the jaw with a punch that had good snap behind it. My head jerked around and I was jarred a little. I let him have a left jab right in the face as I turned with the blow. Blood spurted from his nose and he went backward on his heels. He either tripped or fell and landed on the floor. A kind of animal snarl on his white lips, he started to his feet again. I waited for him, giving him my best layer. The two men who had been in the chairs against the wall moved in fast. The one with blue-white eyes and a missing tooth. He muttered, "I'll hold him, Donnie." His chest bulged like a barrel. Donnie looked like an ex-fighter. His face had been flattened. His ears were out of shape. And he had dull, staring eyes and 83 fists like hams. Donnie started swinging, and while I was busy with him, his playmate moved in behind and pinioned my arms. He had the strength of a truck horse. "Hold him, Russ," Donnie said, while he smashed my jaw right and left. I tried to catch Russ, the one behind me, in the shins with my heel. But he knew that one. He had his legs wide spread and continued to hold me in a vice. Donnie kept slugging. His dull eyes were red around the edges. My teeth started to ache. Donnie said, "You should stay away from Stevie, friend. The boss don't like it none." He sounded sad about the entire thing. My face felt sad, too. He got too close and I need him. He fell back, cursing. Moose Valentine was standing to one side watching, patting his nose with an expensive linen handkerchief. There was a glitter in his black eyes. There was still another man in the room, but he seemed to take no interest in what was going on. He was fat, of medium build. He sat in an armchair that had been partially drawn behind the desk, as though he'd been discussing some business with Valentine before I came in. He wore a heavy, old-fashioned gold watch chain, and attached to one end of it was a small gold penknife. He was quietly and unhurriedly cleaning his fingernails with the blade. He didn't bother to look up. Donnie didn't like being kicked that way. The redness spread into the whites of his eyes. He came in again. I turned, jerking Russ half off his feet. I twisted back fast, got my right arm momentarily free of his mighty grasp and brought the elbow back into his belly. Air went out of him like steam from a safety valve. I kept turning neatly and smoothly and brought up an uppercut to straighten him out. He crashed into Donnie. While I was doing that, Moose Valentine made his move. He used a sap and brought it down on the back of my hand. I don't remember what he was staring to say. Something like, "What's delaying you two punks?" I don't know what else he said after that. The day was Saturday, and it was shortly past 9 o'clock in the morning. My watch told me the time. The calendar on the wall outside my cell told me the other. My head felt as though it had been worked over thoroughly with a riveting machine. I sat up on the hard metal bunk. My clothes looked as if I had slept in them. I had. How many hours? Well, it was sometime around midnight when Moose Valentine had explained to me how he didn't like Stevie going out with strange men. After that he must have called the police and given them a tale of woe. He must be the town's leading citizen to get such fine service. There was an interlude, it came back to me hazily, when I had awakened for a moment some time after Valentine had sapped me. Someone had given me a glass of water. It was Donnie, the dull-eyed bruiser with the bashed-in face. Right after that I had felt like I wanted to lie down and sleep for a month. Now the fuzziness in my brain and the dry taste in my mouth told me the rest. Donnie had slipped me a mild Mickey, to keep me quiet for a few hours. Thoughtful lad, that Donnie. I must look him up later. "How's it?" said the voice casually. I took my hand off my head and looked up. A cop was standing outside the bars. He was hatless, so he was probably the jailer. He grinned. I said, Can the condemned have a cup of coffee before they go to the gallows? Sure, pal, he said. Anything you say. Make it black. Black's the only way we ever serve it, pal. I don't think he really considered me a pal. He went away. I sat there trying to figure out why I was in jail. Moose Valentine, of course, was the man Taylor had so accurately described. Valentine was, in her opinion, one of the last persons to see her husband before Alan Townley had disappeared. She'd mentioned an argument about gambling. And Moose Valentine ran a gambling joint that catered to the rich. Stevie herself had said that Alan Townley came there often. There must be some connection between Valentine and Alan Townley's disappearance. Yet Valentine had not known that I was connected in any way with Alan Townley. The gambler didn't even know me. Certainly he wouldn't have stuck his neck out by having me thrown in the local jail. The answer was that he hadn't suspected anything. I was just a mug who had got into his hair, and he had enough local police protection to be nasty with me about it. He was going to make damn sure that little Stevie was kept safe. That was good. The gal didn't even know my name. And no passes had been intended. The jailer came back with a thick white mug of coffee. He held it in through the bars. I stood up, winced, and walked very carefully over to him. It would have been all right if I could only have walked on deep feathers. Then the shock wouldn't have carried up to my pounding head. I took the cup, grasped a heavy bar with the other hand and sipped the hot fluid. It was strong enough to eat its way through leather. But that was all right. At least I could taste it. I eyed the jailer as I drank. What happened? The man shook his head sadly. Pal, you get yourself involved. You slug a cop. You break our speed laws. You drive while drunk. You disturb the peace. You try assault and battery on a leading citizen. How about spitting on the sidewalk? Now you're just kidding me, pal. I was just kidding when I did all those things they charged me with. Or maybe I was walking and driving in my sleep. Unhun. We got some witnesses. So that's the way it is? He nodded. That's the way it is. When do I come up for trial? I drained the mug and handed it back to him. He said. Soon as the chief comes down to the office, he'll talk to you. Does he bother to come down before lunch? Usually about 10. I sat down and waited. It was 10:30 when the jailer finally took me upstairs. He led the way as far as a heavy oak door on which was lettered neatly in gold. William B. Botts. Underneath this. Chief of Police. You go right in, he said. Then he closed the door softly behind me and I imagined he stood out there in the hall and waited. The chief was seated behind a big desk across the big, airy room. Windows were open and there was the movement of warm summer air. This was the city hall building of the resort town, I presumed. Stores, people, kids and numerous parked cars and station wagons were visible outside on the street. He was a big man, looking well-fed and well-kept behind the wide desk. He was a little bald. I was halfway across the big room when I knew I had seen him before, just a few hours ago. The unruffled fellow who had sat in Moose Valentine's office and calmly fixed his fingernails while the boys worked me over. Oh, good morning, he said softly. He nodded. Feel better? His eyes went back to finish some item in the paper, then he laid the paper aside, placing it neatly on a corner of the large desk. He looked at me again. We studied each other without making any fuss about it. How much bail do I have to raise? I asked. He waved a soft hand, as if such matters were trivial. It might not be necessary. Tell me, sir, why are you here in town? I wondered if he was needling me. Obviously Moose Valentine was paying plenty for protection, and the chief was just a guy who took the orders. I wanted to know where I stood. I shrugged. Just picking up old threads, I told him. I haven't visited here in several years. You know how it is. He smiled softly. Of course. You were in the service, were you not, sir? So they'd gone through my wallet while I was temporarily out of circulation. I nodded. We have some pretty serious charges against you, sir. But I've considered your war record. That copy of your discharge papers, you know. He studied his fingernails to make certain they needed no further trimming. We're not going to hold you. We will say that last night's incident was, the result of a little misunderstanding. I suggest, however, that you forget you ever met the young lady or the gentleman who usually escorts her. I think you know what I mean, sir? He sat quietly, waiting. I can take a hint, I said finally. Good. I guess that's all then, sir. He didn't bother to get up. He leaned back, crossed his fat legs and picked up the morning newspaper. Enjoy our town. Just forget about last night. I went out of the office thoughtfully. I was puzzled. The big jailer was still there. He held out my Panama. "How'd it go, pal?" he asked. "Now you're kidding me," I said. He grinned. "Your keys are in your car parked out front." He motioned toward the front stairs that led out of the building. "So long, pal," he said. He came as far as the open front doors and watched me go down the wide steps of the city hall. I glanced back once and he was still standing there. I wondered if he was doing that in order to point me out to someone else who was going to tail me. I didn't see anyone else watching me, but the tail was probably in plain clothes and good at keeping himself inconspicuous. I drove directly to the hotel parking lot. A shower and breakfast made me practically well again. The back of my head was sore but there were no cuts. The left side of my jaw felt pushed out of line and was going to be stiff for a while. The white linen suit could do with a pressing, but it would pass. I checked through my pockets to make sure I had everything. Nothing in my wallet had been taken. Naturally they'd seen the private eye's license. Perhaps that's why Chief William B. Botts had been lenient. Or maybe he also knew I had once been connected with the DA's office back in the city. I remained puzzled, however, until I discovered that the slip of paper containing Taylor Townley's address was missing from my left pocket, where I had put it last night. Then things began to clear. Either Moose Valentine or the police chief had found that piece of paper. Either would have informed the other. And one of them wanted to know what my connection was with the wife of Alan Townley. For some reason I had been let off too easily by the chief of police. Valentine's orders? Possibly. What was their game? What did they want? If I knew the answer to that one, perhaps some of the mystery around Alan Townley's disappearance would be cleared. TP. I didn't like it. Something was phony about the whole situation. The telephone rang. The voice was soft and pleasant, and ordinarily it would have been a nice voice to listen to. But I winced. It was Stevie. "I've got to see you. May I come to your room?" "You'd better not," I told her quickly. "I think I'm being watched. They'll tail you from the lobby." "I'm not in the lobby. I'm upstairs in my room. The floor above you." "Look, Duchess," I started. But she said, "I'm coming down," and hung up. I put the latch on the door and it wasn't a minute later that she knocked softly, then walked in. She must have used a stairway, for there'd been no sound of the elevator door opening or closing. Stevie looked just as good in the daylight as she had the night before. Her green eyes were a shade lighter but her face was troubled. She came up close to me and I'd have liked it, if I hadn't have known there were probably a few watching outside. "You're all right? You're not hurt?" "Only my feelings, Duchess. I spent the night in the Bastille." She nodded quickly. "I heard. They've let you go?" "The chief practically kissed me goodbye." She stood there saying nothing. Her red lips worried one another for several seconds. Then she stated tensely, "You've got to get out of town. You can't stay here." "Why, Duchess?" She shook her blonde head. "Why?" I waited. I listened for any sound of footsteps outside in the hallway. It was quiet. I don't think anyone had seen her. "Don't ask me," she blurted. I don't know." She stepped closer and touched my arm with her fingers. "I really don't know. But you've got to leave. Please believe me. It isn't safe for you here anymore." I said. "Has it anything to do with Alan Townley?" She stood very still, her eyes blank green pools. I added, "What is it about Townley?" Slowly, she moved her head back and forth. She stared at me almost vaguely and murmured, "He asked me about Townley last night, after they had taken you into town. They found a piece of paper and address you had in your pocket. He wanted to know if you had asked questions about Townley. I told him no." "Was that fat slob of a police chief there, too?" "Yes." "What else did they ask?" "That was all." "Why did he ask it?" I demanded. "Please." She shook her head again. "I told you I don't know." Her eyes came up and pleaded. "I only know that you're in danger. I can feel it. That's why." "Look, Pat," I said quietly, "I'm in a dangerous game. I'm used to trouble. So don't fret about me." I took her arms, she was trembling a little, and guided her to a chair. "But you can help me. Tell me about this Alan Townley." "Up until a week or so ago, he came to the club regularly," She admitted without any hint that she was trying to cover up anything. He seemed to have plenty of money. He was pretty popular. Did he gamble? Yes, heavily. I heard he lost $50,000 one night. How long ago was that? About 2 weeks ago. A distant thoughtfulness climbed into her troubled eyes. She stood up stiffly. I know what you're thinking. I've thought it, too. You don't believe that he... I said. Honey, he's not a lad to shove around. We were both referring to Moose Valentine without mentioning names. But I don't know. I don't know. I stared out the window. She was near me again. I'm afraid, she said very softly. I patted her shoulder. She didn't look like a girl who frightened easily, but nevertheless she was afraid. If anyone asks you, you haven't seen me again. You've forgotten all about me. I led her toward the door. Now, you'd better get out of here. She paused near the door. What are you going to do? That's something I've got to think about, pet. But don't worry about little Gumbo. I remembered something. You live right here at the hotel? She gave me the room number on the floor above, then she left as sadly as though she'd just paid her respects to the dead. I thought perhaps Taylor could add something to it. I didn't need the address that she'd handed me in Chicago last night. It was filed away in my mind. I got the car and drove out there to the lake again. Her cottage was on the far side of the lake, and the road around there did not lead past the oaks, for which I was thankful. Before leaving town I had done some neat driving around back streets until I was positive that I was not being followed. Out here at the lake a tail would have been an easy thing to detect. It was a lazy, warm day. People drifted about in small boats. Some were fishing. Along the shore, near the cottages, others were swimming. You could hear their voices clearly on the soft morning air. The background of trees acted like a sounding board. I found Taylor's cottage, a green and white house guarded by tall stately birches. It looked cool and comfortable. The narrow roadway passed the rear and I parked the car in a short drive that ended at a neat white garage. A pathway led past flower beds to the front of the cottage. The sun filtered down through leaves high overhead and made a splotched quilt of the smooth green lawn. There was a wide screened porch, nicely furnished for easy, gay living. Windows of a large living room and bedroom faced upon it. The windows were wide open, as was the main door to the fairly large house. I stood in the open inside doorway and called. Anyone here? There was no answer. Everything was quiet. I could still hear an occasional voice from down by the lake. Directly in front of the cottage some more people were in swimming. The water was shallow and they were so far out that I couldn't see who they were. I wondered if Taylor was one of them. I was standing there watching when someone moved behind me. It was the amber-skinned maid. Her eyes looked sleepy. Oh, she said. Her teeth shone whitely in her untroubled face. Miss Taylor has been looking for you. She around? She motioned toward the water. They're out swimming. Did you have a nice trip up? Lovely, I said. Was there something you'd like while you wait for them, Mr. Gumbo? I shook my head. I'll just go down there. I dropped my hat on a gay-colored porch swing and started toward the shore. A path cut down the gentle slope. It led to a long, narrow, wooden string fence that ended in a dock and diving platform. A man and woman had just hauled themselves out of the water. They watched a figure swimming some distance from shore. The man turned as he heard my footsteps clattering on the wooden planking. Then he was getting to his feet. Danny Gumbo, he said in surprise. He came over and shook hands heartily. He was a thin, long man with skinny knotted legs and not much chest. But his neat black mustache was in excellent condition. I remembered that his name was Sheldon Patterson and that he was president of Patterson, Martin, and Thomas, one of the big Chicago ad agencies. He'd made money but was still no more than 50. Taylor told us you'd phoned her yesterday in town. What are you doing now? Same business. He turned. The woman coming toward us was his wife. He said brightly. Elsie, you remember Danny Gumbo? The woman nodded. Why, yes. How are you? She held out a strong, bony hand. She had good legs. But that was all. You see women like that. The rest of her was too thin and too lean. She was brown as a nut and her dark, flashing eyes matched. She made up for her figure with something that was in her watchful, questioning eyes. She liked men. She was younger than her husband. Taylor told us you might drop by, she said. Have you a place to stay? There's plenty of room at our place. I'm at the hotel, I told her. Oh, she said. Nothing changed in her face, yet I thought her remark meant something. Sheldon Patterson was staring toward the lake. Look at her, will you, he said, glancing at me. Can't she swim, though? I followed his eyes. There was a sleek, white-capped head, some distance out from shore, and flashing arms that moved steadily in a lazy crawl. The figure was approaching the edge of the dock. We kept watching. Then Taylor raised her head, saw me, gave a joyous shout. Immediately she increased the pace of the crawl and moved through the calm water with powerful strokes. Soon she was climbing up on the dock. She looked just as good dripping wet as any other way, and that was plenty good. She rushed over to clasp my hands. "Gumbo!" she cried. "Let me look at you." She was happy and excited and uninhibited as a pup. "Doesn't he look wonderful?" she asked the others. "I haven't seen him in ages." She did it all up in a nice neat package. She was good indeed. She turned back to me. "How long are you staying?" I shrugged. "I just stopped by. I'm looking up some old friends." "We ought to have a party," said Elsie Patterson. "I get him first," exclaimed Taylor. "We'll see. But first I've got to hear everything he's done since I saw him." "How about tonight?" Elsie asked me. There was some meaning in her eyes and I tried to figure out what it was. "Sure, old man," put in her husband. "This calls for a celebration. Tonight it is." We went back to Taylor's house and the maid, Sierra, served cocktails. Soon Sheldon Patterson and his wife were leaving. "We'll have to get things started," he explained. The maid drifted off, leaving a silver cocktail shaker almost full on a coffee table. Taylor still wore the white two-piece swimsuit. Her stomach between trunks and halter top was flat and hard and brown. Her tawny hair tumbled about her lovely head. She sat down on the chintz-covered divan, unmindful of the wetsuit, and looked up at me, her face serious now. "When did you get here?" "I drove up last night." "You should have phoned me." "It was late." She made an impatient gesture. "I was up." She nodded toward our empty glasses. "You can pour me another cocktail. Did you find out anything?" "About Alan?" "Of course." "Not yet." She bit her lip. "I wish there was something I could tell you. But there's nothing. No word from him, nothing at all. I can't suggest where to start." I asked. "Did Alan owe any money? Gambling debts, for instance?" "No. He had plenty of money." She put down her glass and looked at me quickly. "Oh, I see. That man I described to you. The one who came to see him here that last Saturday. I told you they were arguing. But it couldn't have been about debts. Alan always paid his bills. I didn't even know that man." "Ever hear of Moose Valentine?" She shook her head. I sighed, finished the drink and stood up. "Well, maybe I'd better nose around a bit." "Aren't you going to stay for lunch?" "I better not." I motioned toward the rear of the house. "It's too bad that maid is here." I let her take that for what it was worth. Taylor said quickly. "Don't worry about Sierra. She's wiser than you think." "Just the same." "Please, stay." Her gray eyes took on a lazy, half-sleepy expression. She put her tawny head back against the divan and looked up at me. Her smile was soft. Alluring. "Look," I tried to explain. "Either I work or I play. It can't be both at the same time. I think it'd better be work." Her face changed. Her eyes said she wanted to make some acid comment, then she decided not to. "But you'll go to the party tonight, won't you? Elsie and Sheldon are such nice people." "I suppose we'll have to." She followed me out to the screened porch. "I think you've already learned something about Alan. I wish you'd tell me, Gumbo. Maybe I'll have something tonight." I went around the house to the roadster. Backing out to the lake road, I saw the kitchen curtain move slightly. She should have left Sierra back in Chicago. 4. I was drifting along the highway back to town when I realized, after a while, that a car had been following me. I watched it in the rearview mirror. It snuggled far back, dropping from sight each time I went around a curve. It must have picked me up when I left the lake road. It trailed me into town. I drove to the hotel, parked, went directly upstairs. But before I walked down the long hall to my room I stepped to a wide, curtained window at the front of the hall and peered out. The car that had been following me, a heavy dark sedan, was parked almost across the street close to a fire hydrant. I couldn't make out who was at the wheel. I went downstairs again and crossed the street to the parked car. It was the two lugs who worked for Valentine. The ex-pug, Donnie, was at the wheel. The sandy-haired one with the blue-white eyes sat beside him. I put my hands on the open window and bent forward to look at them. Donnie said, "Well, if it isn't Mac. Small world." "I'm sorry to have to disappoint you gentlemen," I said. Donnie's dull eyes looked puzzled. "Come again, Mac?" "I haven't found him yet. I'll let you know as soon as I do." Neither man spoke. Each gave me an unblinking stare. I grinned, flicked my fingers to my hat and went back to the hotel. When I got upstairs and peered out the window again, the car was gone. In the room I found a yellow telephone slip pushed beneath the door. There was probably a duplicate in the box at the desk, but I hadn't stopped off in the lobby. The writing on the slip said, "Please call me at a number." The timestamp on the message showed that the call had been received only 5 minutes ago. It was a local exchange and I wondered who it was. I gave the switchboard girl the number. A woman's voice answered. A quick, clear, direct voice, strangely familiar. But for the moment I could not place it. "You called me?" I said. "Danny Gumbo?" "Right. This is Elsie Patterson." I frowned. Her voice didn't sound exactly as it had back there on the dock. It held a tense urgency. "Yes?" I said. "I've only a moment. Sheldon will be right back." Her words sounded crowded together like a phonograph record that has been speeded up. "You knew Alan Townley, didn't you?" "Slightly," I said and wondered what was this? "Then you can help me." "T don't understand." She cut me off. "You're a private detective, aren't you? At least, you were?" "Yes." "Well, then I've got to tell you. It's terribly important. If there was any way I could, I'd run into town now, but it's impossible. I'll see you at the party tonight. I'll manage it, somehow, so that we can be alone for a few moments." "I don't like mysterious women," I said. "Tell me now and we'll both spend a restful afternoon." "I can't. Sheldon's liable too." There was a sound as if she had caught her breath, then her voice, very low, finishing in a rush, "He's coming in now. Tonight, then." The connection was broken. I sat there with the phone cradled in my hand and asked myself what it was. Taylor wanted to know whether her husband was dead or alive. Moose Valentine knew some of the answers and was standing off, awaiting developments. And now Elsie Patterson, ambitious socialite, was intensely interested in Alan Townley's whereabouts. There was a lad, that Alan, who got around. I got on the telephone again and made some calls to Chicago. The Office of Internal Revenue was closed for the half-holiday, but I finally located Bill Hendricks at his home in Oak Park. Bill Hendricks was an old friend. He had several brothers, all of them working in various city jobs down there. One was connected with Chief Storm's office at headquarters. Another was a politician. Still another had some connection with a brokerage house. I told Bill what I wanted. "If there's any way possible, I'd like to hear before tonight," I said. "I know that's asking a lot." "Maybe I can do it by phone," he said. "I'll see what I can do." I gave him my room number and the hotel name and hung up. There was little to do now but wait. Somewhere along the line there must be a clearly defined lead to the mystery of Alan Townley. I had an idea that perhaps Elsie Patterson was going to supply that lead. Tonight would tell. I had a sandwich and beer sent up to the room, ordered some newspapers, sent the linen suit down to the valet shop for a press, then stretched out on the bed with the papers. The day was hot. I should have spent the afternoon with Taylor out at the lake, where it was cool. My jaw still ached. At 6 o'clock that evening the urgent ringing of the telephone woke me up. It was Bill Hendricks calling from Chicago. "I got what I could," he said. "I'm not fussy," I told him. "I've been away too long. I don't know what's been going on." "Well, I guess nobody else does either. He's managed to keep it pretty quiet." "Are you talking about Alan Townley?" "Yeah. I reached the right people and I think I've got it straight. The guy's broke, Gumbo. Flatter than the old bankroll on the day before payday. Most of it went down the drain in Wildcat stocks. The rest, Lord knows where else. He's been putting up a swell front, however." "Anyone know where he is?" "No." "Anything else?" "I'll keep working on it for you, Gumbo. Can I reach you there over the weekend?" "Probably. If I'm out, Leave word and I'll call back. Thanks a lot. I hung up. Here was something interesting. So Alan Townley was broke, and even his wife didn't know it. A guy with money is always a target for some kind of pitch. But not a man without it. Paupers usually die of old age. I kept wondering what Elsie Patterson was going to tell me. Taylor and I started for the Patterson place about 9:30 that night. I hadn't told her what I'd heard from Chicago that afternoon. We put away a couple of martinis, and by the time we climbed into the car there was a brightness in her eyes and a manner about her that gave her the appearance of a teenager on her first date. I hoped no one else would notice it. She glowed like a beacon atop the Palmolive building on Michigan Avenue. People might wonder about us. But I needn't have worried. They were all whooping it up by the time we arrived. It was a big place, set on a smooth, velvet lawn slope and screened by tall trees. Down at the foot of the slope there was a large boathouse and pavilion. When you drove up, an efficient fellow relieved you of your car and took it off somewhere to park it. I wondered if he'd be able to find his way back. The patio had been decorated with gay lanterns and people sat out there, with butlers in short white mess jackets serving martinis and dabs of stuff on small crackers. Somewhere in the background a string orchestra played the right kind of soft music. From inside the sprawling stone house a dance band pounded out jitterbug stuff. Taylor said, "We'd better stop inside first and say hello, though they'll probably never know whether we're here or not. They sure whipped this affair together in a hurry." Taylor smiled. Elsie knows how to spend money. We met people roaming in and out, and they said hello, and we said hello, and I asked Taylor, "Who are they?" "Lord knows," she said. But we did bump into Sheldon Patterson, our host. He was maneuvering through the wide front hallway like a sailboat tacking against a stiff wind. He was going to make it to the arched doorway halfway down the hall, but he wasn't going to have much left of the cocktail that he was carrying. He saw us. Or maybe he saw tall, sleek, gorgeous Taylor. He swayed over, bowed and said, "You're lovely," and held out his thin, bony hand. "I'm Sheldon Patterson." I opened the door and some people dropped in. "You'll find them around. Did anyone ever tell you that you're lovely?" Worriedly, Taylor watched the drink jiggling in his hand. Then she smiled at him. "Sheldon, you remember Gumbo?" She turned and gave me some of the smile. He squinted at me rather blearily. He wore good sport clothes and he was not a bad-looking fellow, but his face was too pale. Still, he looked better dressed than he had in the swim shorts this morning. He stuck out his hand. "Glad to know you, old man," he said. I doubt if he knew either of us. He waved vaguely toward some room behind him. "Go have a drink. I'll be back." He winked owlishly. Knowingly. "I've got a prospective client in here, and, boy, is he drunk." He swayed on and disappeared through the archway. I looked after Sheldon Patterson and said, "He isn't doing so bad himself." Taylor nodded and that sweep of soft hair touched my face. They got an early start. They had a dinner party earlier. A maid appeared then and relieved Taylor of her summer ermine cape and took my hat. We waited until she disappeared again. Sheldon never drinks during the week. He's smart and he's a real salesman and showman. He probably has a prospect here tonight. Sheldon will sign him up, drunk or no. A nice business. Probably about $1 million worth. 2 huge rooms had been thrown open and cleared for dancing. At one end was the orchestra, at the other a long table set up with appetizers. 2 waiters were serving cocktails. I saw Elsie Patterson standing nearby, talking to a group of people. She saw us, broke away, and came over. "Hi, kids," she exclaimed brightly. She looked smart and trim and expensive. "Gumbo, I want you to meet these people. I've been telling them about you." She touched my arm. "Come on." It was an ordeal, and no mistake. Elsie Patterson babbled and I wished to hell I'd never let myself in for a thing like this. I tried to recall faces I had known a few years ago, and recognized none. That was the way it was with this kind of cocktail set. Money attracted them like moths around a flame. The moment someone else showed up with a few more dollars in the bank, they joined the pilgrimage to new haunts. After a while more guests arrived. Elsie had to excuse herself to meet them. I'd been trying to escape the "darling, I want you to meet so-and-so" business in order to get Elsie Patterson alone for a second. I wanted to hear the rest about that telephone call. I wanted to hear it now. But too many people were close by. She did manage, however, to slip in a word just before she started across the room. She spoke swiftly and softly. "I'll signal you the first chance I get. Perhaps we can meet on the patio." And in that brief instant there was a troubled light deep in her eyes. Somewhere along the way I'd lost Taylor. I drifted around, eased out of the house, wandered toward the patio. Through the trees I saw one or two lights bobbing on small boats out on the lake. The air had cooled. On it drifted the bright chatter of sophisticated talk. I watched well-dressed, attractive women trying to impress men, and well-dressed, bright-looking lads trying to impress women, and here and there a lady who didn't know how to drink, and others watching her and talking slyly. The little remarks, the knowing glances, the hatreds and jealousies that make people click. All the time I was waiting to hear more about Alan Townley. But an hour went by and I was still muddled. I'd wandered through a garderie, was returning toward a long, wide, open veranda faced with French doors, when I saw Elsie Patterson again. She was talking to a man in a white jacket. They were alone. Everyone else was either inside or around the far side of the house on the patio. Tall shrubs partially cut me off from the two standing there. And the grass had silenced any sound of my approach. Not that I was attempting any peeping Tom business. It was just that I came upon them unexpectedly. After all, if Elsie Patterson wanted to talk to someone. A pale slice of light from beyond one of the French doors touched their faces as they stood there alone. The man was watching those French doors. I was watching the man and suddenly being very careful that the shrubs screened me. He was the slender, dapper gentleman of the burning dark eyes and with the odd gray slash through his black hair. Moose Valentine, gambler. You don't get surprises in this business. You get ideas. If you match the right ideas together sometimes you come up with something. But all you could do with this case was label it the disappearance of Alan Townley. Was the guy dead or alive? Where was he? The ideas weren't doing me much good unless I found him. But perhaps the solution was here in a few swift-spoken words that were being exchanged. Words murmured too softly to be overheard. I was a dozen yards away. If there was some way I could step closer. Then it was too late. Elsie moved toward one of the French doors and entered the house. Valentine waited a moment, then went down 3 wide steps at the end of the long stone veranda and disappeared toward the patio. But the big scene was yet to come, I discovered. It was lucky I hesitated a moment before stepping out of the shadows. Another man was on the long open porch. He'd been standing down there at the far end, his figure blended against a stone column. Now light from one of the doors revealed him clearly. His thin face was set in harsh, grim lines. And he was no more drunk than I was. Cold fury was in his alert, watchful manner. He was our host, Sheldon Patterson. There had been some determined purpose in that little act he'd put on when we met him in the front hall. Chapter 3. Taylor was looking for me when I reached the patio. She looked warm and excited. She grasped my arm and said, "Buy me a drink, darling. Forgive me for running off like that. Everyone wanted a dance." She gave a squeeze. "Now I'm free. I'm not going to let you out of my sight." "Is that a threat? You talk like a wife." Her eyes changed as she looked at me briefly. "Did you have to say that?" "It could have meant a lot of things. I hoped it meant what I thought it did." I murmured, "Sorry, sweetheart," and steered her toward a table away from the string quartet that was still trying to compete with the talking going on all around. The talk and laughter was winning. It had good 100 proof on its side. Taylor's brightness returned as quickly as it had left for the moment. She motioned to one of the butlers as we spotted a table. "Right here should be nice," she started. Then her fingers tightened on my arm. Her quick gray eyes were centered on a table across from us. I followed her intent glance. It was Moose Valentine. That man stopped. "I know," I said. "He's the one who came to see your husband that Saturday." "Yes." She searched my face briefly with her level eyes. "How did you know him?" "We met last night. Would you like to meet the woman with him?" I met her, too. Stevie, the silvery blonde singer, was seated with the sleek gambler. I was positive she had seen me. She was attempting to keep Valentine absorbed in conversation. He had not yet looked across the open space of the patio. People moving back and forth cut us partially from view. Taylor seemed to be struggling to overcome an uneasiness. Her firm fingers pressed into my arm. But almost instantly she said, "All right." We went over. Moose was good. He was polite. I introduced blonde Stevie Deering to Taylor and watched the women size each other up in a single glance. Then I introduced Valentine himself. He was as gracious as a Secretary of State. I said, "It's nice seeing you again," and he said, "Thank you," and deep in his dark eyes there was a soft, watchful, cat-like smile. "I believe you know my husband," Taylor was saying, and I admired her smooth, cool courage, saying that, watching him for any reaction that might tell her something. "Yes, I believe I do," he said, and it didn't tell a thing. "He drops in at my place once in a while." I noticed he wasn't drinking. We went back to the table, where a butler was waiting. Taylor was holding my arm again. She was trembling almost violently. Yet, talking to the gambler, her manner had been casual and outwardly relaxed. But as she sat down she breathed tensely. "God, get me a drink. That man's eyes. He knows something, Gumbo. The way his eyes watch you. Perhaps you're just imagining." "No. I could read something in his eyes, Gumbo. He frightens me. All gamblers have fishy eyes." This was different. I wanted to find Elsie Patterson. I got the opportunity a few moments later. Some people closed in on our table and one of the women said, "There you are, Taylor. Look, here's someone I want you to meet." I told Taylor I'd see her back there in a few minutes and excused myself, heading quickly toward the house. Luck held out. Elsie was just coming through a doorway and she saw me. There were cushioned swings on the terrace. Some were set apart in shadowy corners. I motioned toward one and she nodded. "It's the first chance I've had," she said, sitting on the edge of the swing. Her eyes looked wide and too bright in the shadows. Then she blurted without further delay. "It's about Alan Townley." "That's why you called me at the hotel?" "I couldn't go to anyone else. And it was only last night that a little insignificant thing happened that caused me to wonder. Then I saw the whole awful picture as I thought back, and I was positive." I touched her hand lightly in order to stop her for a moment. She was shaking. "You're getting excited," I warned. "Try to tell it clearly. Right now you're sort of jumbled up." "It's so horrible," she gasped softly. "About Alan, you mean?" "Yes, about Alan. You see," she looked at me quickly, eyes full of some horror that was in her mind. "First, let me explain one thing. Then you'll understand. You see, Alan and I went out a few times together. Sheldon found out. That's why I can't go to him. If I do, he'll know I was with Alan that night, the night." I wanted to tell her to get the hell to the point, but I waited patiently. She was nervous enough. "The night," she started again. "Yes?" She seized my arm as though she were going to faint. Her taut voice was a whisper. "Alan is dead. I know." Then, so softly that I thought I had only imagined hearing the words, "I think I know who killed Alan Townley." Just then a group of people burst out of one of the doors from inside the house. They were laughing and apparently intent on a purpose. One of them saw Elsie and immediately swooped down on her. "We're going to have a swimming marathon," one exclaimed. "With cash prizes," a woman added. "The men have formed a pool. They're going to swim down to the Anderson dock, below here. There's prize for women, too." The speaker grabbed Elsie Patterson's arm and pulled her to her feet. Elsie was an excellent hostess. Instantly she fitted her mood to theirs. She got up laughing and protesting. "I'm not a good enough swimmer. Really? Then you can help judge. Some of us are going to sit in boats and hold flashlights, so the swimmers can see the course." With Elsie in tow, they stormed across the patio looking for more entries. One woman and her partner stared directly at me, and the woman cried, "Hey! Look at him. With a build like that he ought to carry off first prize." The man said, "All right. He's our entry. I'll put 10 on his nose." There was no eluding them. Everyone was going for the idea as though it was the Kentucky Derby. I said, "I look cute without trunks." The fellow who had elected to promote me said, "You don't get off that easy, mister. There's trunks full of shorts upstairs in Sheldon's bedroom. Come on." I glanced across the patio as we started into the house. I didn't see Taylor. I wondered if she had been snared into it, too. Moose Valentine had quietly disappeared. I wondered where he was. A carnival atmosphere reigned on the lakefront. Those who couldn't swim held flashlights and were getting into rowboats. Someone had even located lanterns. The finish line, the dock of another estate down the lake, was merely a part of the outer rim of blackness that was the night. Someone attempted to indicate the spot with a wave of his arm. "Don't worry," he said. "We'll light the course from the boats." Bets were being offered and covered. Each team had an entry in the form of a swimmer. Money changed hands as if it were peanuts. The lad who had elected himself my manager had more good luck than sense. "I've got 300 on you, Gumbo. You win and we split." Well, I've worked a hell of a lot harder for less. I've even taken a slug for that kind of money, when times were tough. "I'll try," I promised him. "Want a drink?" I shook my head. I saw Taylor. She was wearing a swimsuit and a robe, and I wondered if she was in this crazy thing, too. Then some people surged around and I lost her again. I also heard a man calling out across the dark water to someone in a rowboat. "Not that way, Elsie. Row in closer to shore." But I couldn't catch Elsie Patterson's answer. And the cockeyed race was on. The women went first. Flashlight beams revealed their moving legs and arms, but soon they were lost out there in the darkness. Out of the gloom the thin white pencils of light jerked here and there like tiny beacons gone haywire. Laughter floated across the dark water. In the night there was confusion and shouting and voices trying to call direction. After a while you could hear yells from up the lake, and apparently the women's race was over. Then the men were underway. I was in the water, thinking, what a hell of a thing to be doing at midnight. There were 6 of us. We soon were separated, because the rowboats now spread out all over half the damned lake. Some guy was standing up in Flat's gowan waving a bottle. He was high as the Empire State Building. "Right this way, gents," he called out. "Stop off at the 19th hole bar for a quick one." I ignored the boats and the bobbing lanterns and flashlights. Before plunging into the water I'd taken a line on the goal down there in the blackness. I hoped I was heading straight for it. That's how I won the screwy race. I wasn't any better than anyone else. Just soberer. 2 men who had been posted at the goal hauled me up on the dock. The women swimmers had disappeared toward the Patterson place to dress. Another contestant arrived behind me, but the others were all off course. We held flashlights and tried to guide them. You could hear the voices trying to shout directions from the boats. Then all you could hear was the woman's shrill, keening, terrified scream. It came out of the night like a slash of lightning. Every other sound stopped, as everyone heard that awful cry and paused to listen. In the stark silence it came again. "My God!" breathed one of the fellows on the narrow dock beside me. He stared into the night and directed the flashlight beam out into the darkness. The woman's cry had come from close by. A boat leapt into the white cone of light. It was tilted crazily as a woman, on hands and knees, bent over the gunwale. She seemed to be tugging at something in the water. She was trying vainly to haul it into the boat. "Oh, my God!" the man beside me repeated. I was diving off the dock while he was still saying it. No more than 2 minutes were required to reach the boat. The woman kneeling in the bottom, tugging at the figure in the water, was sobbing and half hysterical. I'd met her, but I didn't remember her name. I went up over the stern of the rowboat, so that it wouldn't tilt completely over, dived toward the woman and pushed her aside. "Get your weight on the other side so we won't tip over," I snapped, trying to jar her into clear thinking. I held a fistful of hair as she released the figure in the water. While she balanced the rocky boat, I bent low over the gunwale and hauled the figure overside. It was Elsie Patterson. And I didn't like the looks of her. Not one bit. Her eyes were closed. Being slender, she was fairly easy to handle, though no one who is limp, dead weight is easy to manage. I started working over her while the other woman tried desperately to handle the oars. She was so excited she hardly knew what she was doing. Almost instantly other boats were arriving. A man piled in with us and took over the oars. "Get to the dock," I ordered. "Hurry." He didn't need urging. Blankets were spread out on the dock by the time we arrived there, moments later. Elsie Patterson hadn't yet stirred. I got what water I could out of her, laid her flat on her stomach, turned her face so that she could breathe, and knelt over her and started artificial respiration. I still didn't like the looks of her and yelled up at someone standing over us. "Can we get ambulance?" "The police, in town, have equipment. Call them." But long before they arrived, I knew a resuscitator wasn't going to do any good at all. Elsie Patterson was dead. She had drowned, there seemed no doubt about that. And long before the local coroner arrived, and allowed the body to be moved up to the house where he made a more complete examination, I had noticed something about Elsie Patterson's too thin figure. I was positive she had been murdered. A horrible accident, Chief of Police William B. Botts was saying with the right note of sympathy. Yes, he was there, giving me that half-cynical look he had used at headquarters. I was dressed now. With him were a couple of cops from town. They didn't look very smart. Accident, hell, I said. We were gathered in the big library of the Patterson home. Elsie lay on a leather divan, a blanket covering her, even her face. There were maybe a dozen people in the room. The others had been shut off by the closed doors. They were watching me intently. Lovely Taylor was in the group. I'd learned she hadn't been one of the contestants in the women's race, though she wore a suit and bathing cap. She'd been in one of the rowboats, serving as a guide for the swimmers. Now she stared at me and gasped. "Gumbo. You don't mean that?" I nodded. Chief Botts pushed his fat body in front of me. "You'd better explain that remark, sir." "She wasn't a very good swimmer," I said. "I saw her this morning." "But she wasn't swimming tonight, not in that contest," Botts said softly in a manner he probably thought was suave. "We've already been told that. She probably got excited and fell out of the boat. She was alone out there." "Don't be a fool," I said. "She could have been held underwater. It only takes a part of a minute to drown." The coroner, a stocky, quiet man with glasses, had been listening. Now he put in. "Naturally, I leave nothing to chance. We think of those things, too, my good man. But there are no marks on her throat showing there was any kind of struggle." "But there are marks on her ankles," I said grimly. The coroner nodded. "Marks caused by the straps of her sandals. I saw them." "Were they caused by that?" I asked. No one spoke. One man had not entered the conversation. He stood apart from us, stiff, his face thin and gray and strained. He, too, wore swim trunks over which he had thrown a robe. He was thin as a matchstick. It was Elsie's husband, Sheldon Patterson. Now he spoke for the first time. His voice almost cracked, and he controlled it with a mighty effort. "Just what do you mean, Gumbo?" "I mean," I said harshly, "someone held your wife underwater by the ankles until she drowned. They tilted the boat, then pulled her under." He looked at me out of eyes that seemed frozen. I returned the look. "By the way, Patterson," I said, "where were you all the time?" He looked as if he wanted to hit me. But finally he said, "I was right in the boat with her. She was perfectly all right when I left her." "When you left her?" His eyes glittered. "Tommy Ingalls called me over to his boat for a drink. I remembered the drunk who had been waving the bottle at the start of the men's race. I swam over there. I was afraid something would happen to him. I rowed him into the dock. We had just gotten there when Amy screamed." I said meaningfully, "I suppose Tommy Ingalls can verify that you were with him all the time?" He almost sneered. "Tommy Ingalls passed out and you damn well know it. He won't remember a thing." I was sticking my neck out from here to there. Chief of Police Botts knew it, and was wondering why. But I was remembering Elsie Patterson's swiftly spoken words. "I think I know who killed Alan Townley." And there'd been her secret rendezvous with the gambler, Moose Valentine, and her husband's expression as he watched them. Someone knew that Elsie Patterson had suspected. Because of that Elsie was dead. It had to be murder. It went on for another hour, but we got no place. It was Sheldon Patterson who said quietly, "Chief, do you mind?" He looked ill. He was nodding toward the closed doors. "Fat, officious," Botts said. "Everybody be around for the inquest tomorrow." He swung and gave me his soft smile. "That includes you, sir." Then Sheldon Patterson was leaving the room, murmuring shakily, "There are so many things to do. I'll have to make arrangements." He didn't look at the covered figure on the leather divan. I got hold of Taylor and we got out of there. There was still some questioning going on as the police moved among the other guests. Then they were leaving one by one. What had been a fun evening had swiftly changed into a horrible affair of people speaking in hushed voices and moving on tiptoe. I asked Taylor, "What happened to Moose Valentine?" "The gambler?" "Yes. He left with that singer. The one called Stevie." "Before it happened?" "I'm pretty sure. But it was difficult to keep track of everybody." "I'll take you home," I said. We were going down the steps now and Taylor gave me a swift, thoughtful look. "Then where are you going?" I didn't say. "No, but you're thinking of something." I didn't answer until we began looking for the fellow who had parked the cars. It took about 5 minutes for him to bring it around. Just as we were climbing into the seats, another car came along the drive. It had appeared from a garage at the rear of the place. I paused, one foot on the running board, watching. Sheldon Patterson was behind the wheel of the car. Alone. I got a glimpse of his face. His features were set in stony, purposeful lines. I had an idea of this, I said musingly. He certainly got dressed in a hurry. What do you mean? He's heading for trouble. He's going to see Moose Valentine. Taylor gasped as she held onto my arm tight. That man again? That man again, I said, and climbed behind the wheel. Taylor wanted to ask more questions. But I ignored them. You ought to have something around you, I said. Where are your clothes? She motioned toward the Patterson house, then shuddered a little. Her tanned, bare thighs gleamed in the dashboard glow. I don't want to go back in there tonight, she pointed out. Run me home. I'll change. You'll stay home, I said. Take me with you? Unhun. A few moments later we pulled up in her driveway behind the white cottage. The night was very quiet. It must have been about 2 o'clock. Taylor looked like a bronzed, ivory-smooth goddess in the tight swim cap. She leaned close to a moment. Please be careful, darling. If anything ever happened to you, there was a time to be romantic, but this wasn't it. I was thinking of Sheldon Patterson. Scram, I ordered. Her eyes shone in the night light. Do you have to be so damn cold, she snapped. Babe, I told her, every time I think of that poor Elsie. I shook my head, helped her out of the car, and kissed her because that's what she wanted. I did it. Thoroughly because it might be a long time before I kissed her again. I yanked off the tight-fitting bathing cap and let her tawny hair fall down. I buried my hands in her hair and pulled her head toward me again and kissed her so hard my teeth hurt. Phew, she gasped, staring at me. I drove away still feeling as though someone were running ice water down my back, drop by drop. I sent the roadster roaring around the lake, because I had to catch Sheldon Patterson. Chapter 4. He must have reached Moose Valentine's upstairs office at the Oaks only moments ahead of me. He was in the room when I came along the carpeted hallway, and there were only the two of them. For once, Valentine's strong-arm lads were not around. Patterson must have caught the gambler flat-footed. Thin and gray-faced, Patterson held an automatic in his fist, standing in front of Valentine's desk, and he was talking. I came up to the doorway and paused. They had not heard me. I didn't want to startle Patterson into action. A guy not used to handling guns can do a lot of damage on short notice. Patterson was saying. You'll damn well tell me what was going on, Valentine. Don't think I didn't see you talking to my wife on the veranda tonight. I knew she'd been going out with some man. Valentine's voice was tight but calm. You're a blind fool, Patterson. What did you have on Elsie? Why did she withdraw $25,000 from her personal bank account a few weeks ago? Valentine was on his feet, his face hard and his black eyes blazing. He was taking an awful chance on getting drilled. But I didn't think Patterson would shoot just yet. He had more to say, and I wanted to hear it. But it was the gambler who said. She drew that money out of the bank to help Alan Townley. He was the man she was chasing around with, you blind sap. Townley was broke. He came here one night and made a desperate attempt to clean the house in order to get some money. Instead, he lost $50,000. Valentine yanked a slip of paper from his pocket and threw it on the desk. Read it. There's his I.0.U. For a little while the office was deathly silent. I saw Patterson's trim head bend slightly to glance at the note, while he kept the automatic leveled in his fist. Then why were you talking to her so secretively tonight? The tone of Patterson's voice had changed. There was doubt now. I'll tell you why. Your wife suspected the truth, that Alan Townley was dead. I'd had somewhat the same idea. That's why I was playing it safe. A man owes me $50,000 and he disappears. Suppose he's found murdered? Someone learns that I hold that I.0.U. And I'm the fall guy for the murder. He gave a short, brittle laugh. That private dick shows up here and he's looking for the guy, too. So I figure I'll let him do the looking. What detective? Demanded Patterson. Gumbo, the fellow who was at your house tonight. What do you think Alan Townley's wife has him up here for? Gumbo's supposed to be good. He's a tough article when he wants to be. Sheldon Patterson thought a moment. Then he blurted. You talk too easily, Valentine. The doubtful tone had left his voice. It was accusing again. "If Townley's dead, then you killed him. And then you were afraid Elsie would talk, so you..." It was time for me to move. Patterson's voice started to tremble as he mentioned his wife's name. He was working himself up to the task, and if he got there, he would do some damage. I didn't want to get caught in that kind of trouble. His fingers were white where they held the gun. I stepped quickly inside the room. "Patterson," I said softly, not to startle him too much. He swung and came around with the gun not a foot away from me, which was exactly where I wanted it. If the gun is held too far away from you, the judo trick won't work. My right hand slashed down, caught the barrel of the automatic and carried it downward and to the left. In the same fast movement my left hand seized Patterson's gun hand just at the wrist in a crisscross impact. The weapon twisted easily from his hand. It's a trick of leverage and timing. Even a woman could do it with practice. I dropped the automatic into my pocket and said, "Everything he's told you, Patterson, is true. You're forgetting one thing. Valentine, here, wasn't even at your place tonight when Elsie was, when it happened. He'd left." Valentine looked at me and nodded. "Thanks," he said, and he really meant it. Patterson sat down. His thin shoulders drooped. He must have thought a hell of a lot of her. He turned to Valentine again. "What else did Mrs. Patterson tell you?" "She had an idea about something," Valentine explained. "She had an idea Alan Townley's body was right out here in the lake. I don't know what it was that started her thinking about it. She was going to explain in more detail later." He was telling the truth, no doubt about that. I recalled Elsie's own words to me. He added, "I thought it was funny, if he was in the lake, that the body had not been found. Then I remembered the lake overflows down here at this end near a small dam. It's stream-fed at the other end. That creates a current that would carry a body this way. I've got a couple of the boys out there looking now, just on chance." "Could Townley swim?" Valentine slowly shook his head. "That's something else. I just found out a little while ago that he couldn't." Suddenly I saw a need for hurry. I said, "Let's see if they've found anything." Valentine nodded. We took Patterson with us. He was in a bad way. A guy in that condition is liable to do himself no good. Keeping him occupied was the best thing. We drove down to the end of the lake, not far from the Oaks. Valentine used his own sedan. The dam was a concrete wall not more than 50 yards across, half concealed by old trees and brush that grew wildly at this part of the lake. Russ, the barrel-chested fellow with the blue-white eyes, was there, and the ex-pug, Donnie. They were smeared with mud and rubbish that had collected in the heavily barred gate just below water level of the dam. Alan Townley was there, too. He wasn't very nice to look at. They'd pulled him up with iron grappling hooks. He must have been caught down against the gate for a week or so, below the water level. I wouldn't have known him, but Valentine and Patterson made the identification positive. A moment later I found myself staring at the palms of my hands. I held them up, looking at them, and felt that drip of ice water along my spine again. Valentine glanced at me curiously as I rubbed my hands down across my hips, as though to rid them of the coldness that I felt there. I drew Valentine to one side and told him where I was going. I also asked him some questions. His dark eyes showed astonishment. It was the first time his poker face had ever revealed his feelings. "Call Fatso, the police chief," I said. "Have him meet you there. Give me 10 minutes or so alone over there. I want to find out something." "You take a hell of a chance, Moose Valentine." "We'll see." I left, alone. I figured not more than 20 or maybe 25 minutes had elapsed since I had started for the gambler's office. That wasn't too long. A few moments later I left the roadster parked along the curving road. I walked the rest of the way. Crickets chattered at me as I moved silently through the night. There was a light on upstairs, in the bedroom. Downstairs was in total darkness. I went up the steps and across the outside porch and found the house wide open. No one ever locks doors at a lake colony. I stood just inside the living room and waited until my eyes adjusted to the inside shadows. Then I found the stairs and climbed them like a tomcat on the prowl. Light came from the open bedroom doorway. There was a soft humming sound, like an electric fan running in the night. I stepped quietly to that doorway. She sat on a bench before a vanity mirror. She wore some kind of negligee, and there was no doubt about it that she was an elegant kind of creature. Thick tawny hair tumbled about her shoulders. The soft humming sound came from the electric dryer that she held in her hand. She was just about done. She had not heard me. I said, "Taylor?" She turned with a startled jerk. A sharp intensity leapt into her gray eyes. "I discovered your hair was wet when I kissed you just a short while ago," I said. "Yet you weren't swimming in that race tonight. You were supposed to be sitting in one of the rowboats. You never mentioned being in the water. While the excitement was going on, that lovely body of yours dried off. But your hair didn't. That's why you kept on the rubber cap, isn't it?" She didn't answer. Caution was in her eyes. There was a brief silence. "We've found him," I said. "He couldn't swim, could he? And Elsie Patterson was a weak swimmer. You drowned them both by pulling them under. You're an excellent swimmer, Taylor." She came stiffly to her feet, putting on an expression of clever, amazed horror. "Gumbo," she gasped. "Cut it, Taylor," I said bitterly. "I've learned too much. Alan was broke. You knew that, though you pretended not to. And what you want more than anything else in the world is money. You live for it. The only way you could bleed more out of him was to have him dead. He had plenty of insurance." I dragged the words out and felt cold as ice while I was doing it. "You planned bringing me up here, and then cleverly steering me toward Moose Valentine, all the time pretending you didn't even know the man. But you did. He just told me. He told Emmy something else. He phoned you about Alan's IOU." I came closer to her. I had to hold myself in, for I had a terrible desire to hit her. "Tonight at Patterson's house you pretended shock when you saw Valentine. There was that man you had told me about, you said. But you knew him all along." "Stop it," rasped Taylor. "Stop, hell," I snapped. "You killed Elsie Patterson tonight because you were terrified when you saw Valentine at the party. You knew she had been out with Alan, your husband. You knew Elsie's husband, or Valentine, was in a good spot to take the rep. You knew about the I.0.U. and Valentine, and you steered suspicion toward him. But you couldn't find Alan's body. It must be someone else. Somehow you would have led someone to that discovery." Only once did she show fear. Her tongue moved swiftly over her red lips, then her mouth set in a thin line. A sneer wiped all the beauty from her face. "Prove it," she flung at me. I came up to her and seized her by her lovely shoulders. My hands cut into her smooth flesh. "You're going to confess," I warned her. She screamed. I held onto her. I shook her so hard her negligee fell off one shoulder. The maid, Sierra, heard the racket and came rushing in from another room. She pounded helpless fists on my back and screamed. Taylor was terrified. To mar that smooth beauty of hers was far worse than death. She kept screaming in ungodly terror. And I hadn't done a thing except to hold and shake her a little. It was the fear that was in her mind that made her crack. "All right," she screamed. "I killed them. I'll tell you everything. Only don't hit me. Please," she sobbed. During all the bedlam, Valentine and the big man Chief Bots and the others must have arrived. I was so intent I never heard them. But they heard her words, and that was the finale. They were right there in the upstairs hall. It was the next afternoon before I could be alone again. There had been details to clean up. We learned Taylor had even consulted an insurance agent preparatory to filing a claim for Alan's insurance. She'd told them she suspected foul play, and just wanted to know where she stood and how much would be coming if something had happened to her husband. Going to them first was another one of her clever moves. What murderer would ever consult an insurance company before the corpse was found? She had cool nerve. Day was Sunday, and I'd been up for hours, and what I needed more than anything else before I started back to Chicago was a drink. The hotel bar didn't open until 1 in the afternoon. I went down there after checking out of the room, parked my bag near the bar and climbed on a stoolie. "Some bourbon," I told Stocky, Bull Joe, the same fellow who had been there when I picked up Stevie. "I guess it's tough," he said seriously as he set a shot glass and bottle before me. "I've been hearing about it." "Yeah," I said. "A lousy business." He saw I didn't want to talk, so he walked away and left me alone. The bar was deserted. Then someone came in. I turned. She was nice. She had silvery blonde hair and deep green eyes. "A smooth number you'd like to take places." She sat down on the stool beside me. "I just heard you were driving into Chicago," Stevie said. "I thought I might ride along. I have a few days off. I want to see my agent about the fall season, when things close here." Joe looked at me like he had the other night, but he didn't have to worry. I said to Stevie, "Right now's a bad time. I wish you hadn't asked me." I patted her smooth shoulder gently. "Some other time when you're in Chicago, look me up and drop around. Maybe things'll be different. I don't know. I don't know." I finished a drink, put a bill on the bar and picked up my bag. Stevie was looking at me. She wasn't looking at me like any other woman would in a moment like that. I think she understood. I would have been willing to bet she'd call me someday. And I'd probably be glad when she did. The end.